They built machines so fast the NHRA had to ban them. One explosion, one rule key, and drag racing was never the same again.
It was the mid-1960s when the drag strip was the ultimate battlefield. Every weekend, America's biggest car makers went to war, chasing glory down the quarter mile. But then came a few machines so powerful, even the NHRA couldn't handle them. Engines that twisted rules, shredded tires, and left officials terrified of what might come next. These weren't ordinary racers. They were factory-built beasts that broke records before the ink on the rulebook could dry. And one by one, they were banned. This is the story of the cars the NHRA tried to control but never truly could. The 1960s were a wild time for drag racing when Detroit's fastest machines pushed beyond reason. But some went too far. Their engines roared louder, ran quicker, and broke every rule in the NHRA book. These weren't just fast cars, they were the ones the NHRA couldn't handle. In the early 1960s, American drag racing stood at a crossroads. The National Hot Rod Association, NHRA, had grown into the guardian of the quarter mile, setting rules for stock, superstock, and the emerging factory experimental FX classes. Detroit's Big Three, Ford, Chrysler, and Chevrolet, were battling not just one another, but the rulebook itself. They poured engineering muscle into high-performance machines, determined to prove their streetcar image meant more than just showroom appeal. One of the keystones of this era was the FX class, introduced for stock automobiles that use optional equipment, yet were optimized specifically for drag racing. The idea was this: you buy a production vehicle, but you could fit it with high-performance parts to compete. On paper, this sounded fair. Into practice, it became anything but. By the mid-1960s, engineers were bending the rules the moment they were written. They increased engine size, added fuel injection, advanced camshafts, lightened bodies, and in doing so, pushed their machines beyond anything the NHRA had anticipated. Take Ford's 407 Cammer engine, a 367 cubic inch powerhouse with overhead cam and hemispherical combustion chambers developed for drag use. It was rated at 600+ horsepower before tuning, a figure almost inconceivable for a production car. Meanwhile, Chrysler's 426 Hemi, already legendary, went through diet programs, magnesium parts, aluminium heads, all in the pursuit of that 1 mile per minute gain. These engines went into cars, yes, but the tactics went further. They started altering wheelbases, shifting weight distribution, reducing body panels to exotic alloys, all while still wearing legal-looking VIN plates. The design innovations were breathtaking. Engineers understood that raw power was nothing without traction, and that track time depended as much on getting the power to the ground as it did on generating it. Thus came downsized platforms, shortened wheelbases, increased rear weight bias, wide slicks, and radical fuel systems. Chrysler, for example, built a handful of AFX cars in 1965 that featured forward-moved wheels and a 110-inch wheelbase, so the 406 Hemi, over 650 pounds deep, could still achieve a near 44.56 weight distribution. The NHRA considered this too far removed from the showroom version and refused to sanction them. Ford responded with SOHC, single overhead cam, 427 engines in Mustang 2+2 and Comet Cyclone fastbacks built by Holman and Moody and Bill Stroppy Engineering. Again, these cars were built for the strip, not the boulevard. Controversy followed innovation. The NHRA's mission was to keep drag racing on a foundation of somewhat production-based cars. When manufacturers built cars that broke the spirit, even if they met letter of the law, the NHRA took notice. The FX class became a battleground between factory ambition and regulatory oversight. Official sanctioning numbers dropped for FX as costs skyrocketed and cars became increasingly exotic. By 1966, the FX class was essentially folded into other classes or abandoned altogether. The reason? The cars had become too disconnected from the showroom, too costly, and too unbalanced for the playing field the NHRA intended. Why did it matter? Because these cars defined an era. They forced the NHRA to ask itself, if the rules are continuously compromised by factory teams, who is racing for the spirit of competition, and who is building marketing tools? For fans, these machines were the embodiment of raw American muscle, scientific engineering meeting the raw quarter mile. For the manufacturers, they were proof that performance sold cars. But the line between promotional vehicle and purpose-built drag machine blurred. Eventually, the NHRA drew it back. Engine size grew, horsepower soared, and the sanctioning body had to defend its rulebook. and with it, the sport's credibility. These developments left an indelible mark on racing culture. The FX cars and their contemporaries laid the foundation for the funny car and pro stock developments that followed. They also seeded the collector market. Years later, you'd find one of those rare factory drag cars at a barn, rediscovered and showcased for what it represented. Their legacy lives in the fiberglass doors, the wheel-standing launches, and the ear-splitting exhaust drones that drag fans still cherish today. They mattered because they bridged streetcar myth and unmatched performance, and they forced the NHRA to adapt. In the end, though, the conflict was inevitable. When factory teams treat the placard as a suggestion rather than a rule, the sanctioning body must respond. And that response in the mid-60s was to clamp down. Car bodies had to remain closer to stock. Engine mountings had to stay within original wheelbases, and altered suspension or wheelbase tricks were increasingly banned. The NHRA effectively said, "You can innovate, but only if you still resemble something your average enthusiast could recognize in the mirror." Those factory beasts that couldn't comply, they found other venues, match races, or private circuits, and in that sense, they were the cars the NHRA couldn't handle. By 1965, the tension between raw factory ambition and the National Hot Rod Association's desire for fair play had reached a breaking point. The class known as Factory Experimental (FX), originally aimed at giving production-based cars a chance to stretch their legs, had morphed into something far different. What started as bring the performance car you can buy became build a race car that looks like you could buy it, and the NHRA found the line it thought was clear had been crossed. Factory Experimental was introduced in 1962 to rein in the gap between the superstock category and the increasingly wild parts that factories and dealers were supplying. The rules stated that the car had to be a model-year stock automobile using optional equipment or factory parts, so theoretically, anyone could buy the same car off the showroom floor. But by 1964-65, the manufacturers weren't content with optional equipment alone. They were building purpose-built drag machines with extreme modifications. For instance, the 1965 Plymouth factory altered wheelbase cars from the Chrysler camp, altered wheelbases by moving wheels forward 15 inches, dropped body panels to acid-lightened steel or fiberglass, and ran big block 426, or similarly tuned engines with drag slicks and other race-only gear. The builders knew what they were doing. They were chasing match race dollars, publicity and dominance, not just class trophies. The NHRA looked at a scene where these stock cars now had naked fiberglass hoods, bare magnesium parts, radical chassis tweaks and suspension moves that barely resembled anything you could drive home. Many of them were never sold to the general public in meaningful numbers, or if they were delivered only to select dealers or hot rod insiders. The line between streetcar and purpose-built drag monster blurred fast. One journalist later described the FX class as too factory, too race, not enough production car, and said the end came because the sport's rulekeeper simply couldn't keep up with the engineering arms race. One major conflict was cost and visibility. As manufacturers poured money into FX efforts, the cars became very expensive, specialized, and not really relatable to the everyday enthusiast. The NHRA's mandate was to promote fair, accessible drag racing machines that fans could recognize, maybe even aspire to buy or see in a showroom. When a car debuted that looked more like a top-fuel dragster wearing a body shell, it challenged the foundation of that mission. Meanwhile, friction grew between Ford, Chrysler, and Chevrolet over who was pushing further. For example, when Chrysler developed its altered wheelbase cars and began running 10-second quarter miles at 140 miles per hour from what looked like a family sedan, Ford publicly objected, and the NHRA stepped in. A pivotal moment came at the 1965 season. The NHRA rulebook still attempted to require that any wheelbase alteration be within 2% of stock, but that rule was being stretched or ignored as some cars featured dramatic front or rear axle moves to optimize weight transfer off the line. The altered wheelbase machines, especially from Mopar, were seen by many as unfair advantages. They leapt away from the line, outran rivals, and rendered the playing field lopsided. In turn, the NHRA began to view the FX class less as legitimate competition and more as a marketing arms race for the majors, where the actual buyer car was an afterthought. Another conflict revolved around the notion of production availability. The FX rules insisted that optional equipment used in the car had to be factory listed or available to the public. But engineers found workarounds, engine packages sold only in small numbers, body parts diverted to drag teams, and dealer competition specials made available in limited quantities. That raised the question, was this still a showroom car or a disguised race car? One account described how a Pontiac Tempest, carrying a 421 CID engine in FX competition, was essentially a super stock-level engine, swapped into a compact body that never had true factory mass production. The NHRA watched as this concept of street car with optional race parts morphed into race car with street registration, and they weren't comfortable letting that continue unchecked. Safety also played a part. These cars were hitting elapsed times and trap speeds that far exceeded what many competitors were prepared for, or what partial safety measures in the time allowed. The jump in performance led to increasing risk for drivers and the sanctioning body's liability. As the gap between what was street legal and what was strip-only widened, the NHRA realized that if the machine looked like a car you could buy and drive, yet behaved like a dragster, the spectators and drivers might assume one thing while facing another. That ambiguity became a liability. Ultimately, the NHRA made a decision. By 1966, the factory experimental class was essentially retired as originally conceived. The sanctioning body folded many cars into new categories, like experimental stock, or shifted them into exhibition/match racing, where rules were freer. One historian noted, "The end came when Ford and Chrysler executives decided the outrageous flip-tops and altered wheelbase cars had evolved to a point where there was too much disconnect with the showroom models they were supposed to be promoting. The engines, bodies, and wheelbases had outpaced the rulebook's intent, and the NHRA drew a line. This turn of events stands out in automotive history because it highlights how competition and regulation collide when innovation runs unchecked. The cars that once celebrated what you can buy became the very machines the NHRA couldn't handle. They forced the sport to re-examine its priorities, maintain relatability, or chase unlimited speed. For the fans aged 55 and above who remember the roar of those thousands of drag strips, the conflict isn't just about regulations, it's about watching the sport they loved change in months, not years. In a broader sense, that era's conflict birthed a new kind of drag car, the early funny cars, and set the stage for professional series and specialized vehicles. Without the FX conflict, who knows if the modern funny car or pro stock classes would look the way they do today. So the twist isn't just drama, it's legacy in motion. The very machines that threatened the rulebook became the catalysts of a new racing era. By the end of the 1960s, the inferno that began with the factory-backed too-fast-to-manage machines had burned bright and then gone out, but its smoke hung in the air for decades to come. The very cars once banned by the National Hot Rod Association, NHRA, forced change at the heart of drag racing and left a legacy more complex than a simple triumph or defeat. The era that produced the cars the NHRA couldn't handle did not just vanish, run a whole defeat. It transformed the sport, shifted public perception, and redefined what a muscle car could mean. Those purpose-built machines, altered wheelbase bodies, high-compression big blocks, fuel injection, or even early nitro attempts were born in a moment when manufacturers felt they had nothing to lose and everything to prove. But when the NHRA finally drew its line, declaring that the link to showroom cars must remain real, the factory programs either pulled back or shifted gears entirely. In 1966, the FX class was effectively dismantled. Its remnants rolled into experimental stock, XS, or off the sanctioned class list entirely. That moment marked not only the downfall of a class, but also the rise of something new. Because what the NHRA banned did not disappear into oblivion, it metamorphosed. The radical cars became the seed for the funny car phenomenon. Tube-frame drag machines with flip-top bodies, oversized slicks, and off-the-chart performance. The same logic applied to the path of high-performance showroom cars. The public demanded bigger power, but regulations and insurance costs brought the muscle car industry to heel by the early 1970s. The fallout of the ban era thus split into two pathways, the track and the street. On the track, the machines once deemed unmanageable became legends. The match race circuits took up the mantle, the flip-top funny cars wowed crowds, and drag racing grew more professional, more specialized, and less tied to what the average driver might see in their driveway. Meanwhile, the showroom marketplace shifted. Environmental concerns, safety laws, insurance costs, and looming oil crises curtailed the wild factory support days. That means the very cars whose engines made headlines in trade magazines and whose launches made eardrums ring suddenly became relics of a golden gone era. For the 55-plus enthusiast watching today, This emotional climax rings with nostalgia. You remember the smell of burnt rubber. You remember walking the pits at Indy or Pomona. You remember the name of the driver, the model of the car, the roar of the big block under hood. But you also remember why those machines ended, because they reached beyond credible production routes, because the sanctioning body said, enough. The legacy then is bittersweet. A dazzling flash of mechanical brilliance followed by a recalibration of what drag racing, and by extension what muscle cars could be. And yet the story does not end with the ban. The heritage lives on in collector shows, restoration projects, and vintage drag events. The same models you once saw churn around a quarter-mile are now prized, their rarity and context making them treasures. The P-lines, the 407s, the modified wheelbases, they are museum pieces. Conversation starters. Reminders of a time when horsepower ruled and the rulebook chased. Enthusiast magazines and nostalgia series keep the memory alive. Furthermore, the influence of that era is felt every time a modern drag car hits the strip, because without those radical FX machines and the NHRA's reaction to them, the cars we celebrate today might look very different. In a broader cultural light, this chapter mirrors the arc of the American muscle car itself, bold, uncompromising, spectacular, then reined in. That resonates deeply with men and women who grew up in the 1960s and 70s, saw the showroom battles, heard the factory ads, witnessed the crash of the pony car wars. So when you say the cars, the NHRA couldn't handle, you're also saying, a moment when ambition outran regulation, a moment when promotion outpaced production, and a moment when the street and the strip shook hands, briefly. It is important to realize the downfall was not defeat, it was evolution. The ban did not kill the spirit, it redirected it. The FX era ended, but it handed the baton to a larger movement in drag racing and automotive performance. Without it, the modern categories of racing, the collector cult of vintage muscle, and the what-if conversations at car shows would be poorer. Many of those banned machines are now legends, their rarity partly owing to the very regulation that pushed them aside. Their value is not just monetary, it's symbolic. So here we stand today, decades later, yet still listening for the roar, still feeling the tension of first gear, still remembering the car that once upon a time, even the NHRA said we can't handle that. The legacy is more than metal and rubber. It's a story of ambition, rebellion, adaptation, and endurance. For every 55-plus viewer who remembers those stands, the smell of fuel and smoke, the look of a deck lid flying open, this moment in history lives in more than photographs. It lives in the memory of what happens when raw power meets the rulebook, and when the rulebook says enough, but the engineers say not yet. That's the emotional climax, a burst of mechanical might, a rule change that rewrote the game, and a legacy that refuses to fade. The cars may have been banned, the class may have collapsed, but the spirit, the story, the memory, those live on. When the smoke cleared and the rulebooks thickened, the NHRA might have thought they restored order, but what they really did was immortalize chaos. Those cars, the wild, unmanageable beasts that broke their own boundaries, became legends, not because they won, but because they weren't allowed to. They were the forbidden fruit of American engineering machines so advanced, so fearless, that even the sanctioning body of speed couldn't contain them. Their downfall wasn't the end of an era, it was the spark that ignited everything that came after. From funny cars to pro-stock monsters, every modern drag machine still carries their DNA. Every roar on the strip today is a faint echo of those banned engines screaming in defiance. For the men and women who stood by those tracks in the 1960s, you remember the sound, the vibration in your chest, the moment when horsepower ruled and rules were only suggestions. Those weren't just cars, they were characters. Each one had a soul, a story, and a heartbeat that refused to die. And even now, decades later, they remind us of something simple yet powerful, that progress is born from rebellion. When someone says, you can't do that, there's always an engineer, a racer, or a dreamer who says, watch me. So if you've ever stood beside a rumbling V8, felt your pulse sink with its idle, or smiled at the sound of a cold start on a quiet morning, then you know exactly why these legends mattered. The NHRA could ban their engines, their classes, even their names, but they could never ban their legacy. If you believe these cars deserved better, smash that like button. And if you still believe in the golden age of raw power and fearless innovation, subscribe to Regal Rides. Because here, we don't just remember history, we bring it roaring back to life, one legend at a time. The cars may have been banned, but their fire still burns.